Hey, what's up guys? It's Pedro here from noobcoder.com, and in this tutorial we are going to be introduced to functional components as well as going over props. Now what a functional component is basically another way of writing a class component. It's just a plain JavaScript function which returns JSX. So there are two different syntaxes to declaring a functional component. The first syntax is just to declare a regular function. So let's say I want to create a component. We'll call this function A. And this function, all it has to do is return JSX. So I could say return, and just for simplicity, let's say hello from component A. Right? So now that I have this functional component declared, now it's time to use it. And in order to use it, we're going to put it within our app component. So if we want this to be displayed within here, we could just say a / and then end it like that. Now it's important to notice that a has to be capital. So any user-defined components always has to start with a capital no matter what. And since we're not putting any children within here, this has to be self-closing. So you can't have it like that, for example. It has to be self-closing and it must begin with a capital. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's bring up the web page and you see we get the following output. Hello from component A. But there's another syntax to functional components, and that is to use arrow functions. So instead, let us use another example. So we could just leave this here. I can say const B, and we could set that to this arrow function. And then all we need to do is return some JSX. All right, so pretty similar, and the same thing. Let's stick component B inside our app component. Let's go ahead and save this, and let's take a look. You see that we get the same exact outcome. So there is no difference between using just a regular function or using an arrow function when it comes to functional components. All right, so now that we got functional components out of the way, let's talk about props. So props are data that you could pass from the parent component to a child component. So what I mean by parent and child? Well, we have this component named app, and since component A is within the app component, that means that the app component is the parent of component A, making this a child component of the app component. And the same thing can be said with component B. Now let's say I want to pass data from the parent component, which is app, to the child component. Well, in order to do that, we just hit a space and I can give it a prop. So I could say first name, and let's go ahead and say Pedro. So now I've passed data to this A component, but now I have to access this data. So if we come here within our A component, we receive an argument called props. So now from here, what I can do, and we're just doing this for learning purposes, is print out what props is. So let's take a look at that. So let's save this. Let's open up the web page. Let us go ahead and hit F12 and go ahead and look at the console. And you see that we get an object back. And this object has the data that we pass from the app component to our component A. Okay, so this is props, and props is just short form for properties. That's what it means. But it's basically an object. So now let's say that I want to output what I got from the app component. So let's go ahead and let's make a div. Remember, we can only return one thing, so we have to wrap everything within a div. And let's go ahead and make an h2 tag, and we'll output what we got. So we saw that props is just an object. So what we can do is say props.firstName. So now if I save this, let's open up the browser. You can see that we get hello from component A, and we get Pedro. So our app component passed down first name as a prop, and component A is just displaying that prop. Now, you are not limited to only passing in one thing. you could pass in as many things as you want. So let's say that I want to pass last name, for example. I'll just say Mercado. Come up here. Let's make a copy of this. And we'll change this to last name. So if I save this, take a look at the web page, you see that we get our Pedro Mercado. So our first name and last name as a prop. All right, so now that that is out of the way, now this component A is only receiving 2 props, but sometimes you'll have a component receiving a lot of props. Now what you'll find is a lot of people like to do some destructuring. So from here, since this is just an object, we can destructure what we want out of the props object. So we can say first name, and that's going to pull that out from the props object, and last name. And for now, let's go ahead and comment this out. And instead of saying props.first name, props.last name, this can be a little bit tedious depending on the amount of props that you're passing down. We can just remove that and just say first name and last name. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's bring up the web page, and you see we get the same exact result. So everything that I showed you guys that I'm showing for this functional component applies to this functional component, exactly equivalent. So if I wanted to pass down props into component B, same exact syntax. You'll be props, and then we could give it a div, put everything in here. Let's make a copy of that, delete this. And we could say props.name. And then likewise, we come down here, and this time we named it name. So we're gonna have to pass a prop called name, and we could say Peter. Let's go ahead and save this, and we get the same exact expected behavior. So again, I'm not gonna give every single example, but you get the point. Whatever works for this functional component will work for the arrow version of a functional component. Okay, now you can also pass props to class-based components. So let us actually go ahead and create a new component. We'll say class C extends component. And remember, we are required to have a render function. And this render function has to return some JSX. And just to save some typing, let's go ahead and copy that. Now there is a difference between functional and class-based components, and the only difference is in order to access props within a class-based component, you have to do it through the this keyword. So for example, I can say this dot props dot name, but this time let's say I'll call it age, and we'll change this to component C. Come down here to our app component. We want to render out component C, and the prop that we're passing to component C is age. Now, in order to pass a number, you're going to have to use curly braces. Curly braces means that this is going to be interpreted as JavaScript. And let's say I put 500 here. So if I save this, let's go ahead and open up the web page. You can see that we get hello from component C, and we get 500. Okay. So let's give a couple more examples. So we gave an example with strings. We gave an example with a number. You could put an expression in here. So let's say some math, and we'll set that to 1 plus 1. So some math will have the value of 2. And just for the fun of it, let's give an array as a prop. So we could say some array. And like I said, put the curly braces, you pass in JavaScript. So we'll have this array 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so now let's come up to our component C, and let's go ahead and print out the props that we're getting. So we have to say this.props because this is a class component. Let's go ahead and save this. Take a look at the web page. You can see that we get an object with the props that we're passing down into the component. So we have age, Some math does get evaluated into 2, and you get some array, which passes in the array. All right, so next, let's talk about destructuring for classes this time. So we had destructuring for functional components here, but if you wanted to do the same thing for classes, what you can do is we could come up here and I could say const, and what we could do is pull out from this dot props what we want to display. So I can say I want to pull out age. I completely forgot what I named it. We had some math and we had some array. And instead of using this.props.age, what we can do is just pass in age. And let's go ahead and make copies of each of these. We'll do some math. Just for the heck of it, let us output the array. So let's go ahead and save this. And you see that we get the age, our math expression is being evaluated, and our array is getting printed out. One thing to note is that props are immutable, meaning you cannot change them. So for example, let's go back to functional components. Let's say for component A, first name is set to Pedro. So I could come up here, and for now, let's just make this back into props. Let's go ahead and comment this out. And let's say that I wanted to do props.firstname, and I wanted to set this to Peter instead of Pedro. So let's go ahead and save that and take a look at the output we get. So here we go, cannot assign to read-only property. So all it's saying is, hey, props are immutable, which means you cannot change them. So first name is always going to be set to Pedro, no matter what. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover within this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next one.